In the heart of Los Angeles, amid the glittering lights and clinking champagne glasses, Daniel Carter, a successful and arrogant real estate mogul, is the center of attention at yet another lavish party. Daniel is known for his confidence, his victories, and his unwavering belief that nothing is beyond his control. That night, as the chatter and laughter echo through the grand ballroom, Ryan Coleman, a smart lawyer and longtime friend of Daniel's, approaches him with a sly smile. There's always been a bit of competition between the two, and Ryan enjoys challenging Daniel. "Daniel," Ryan sneers, swirling his glass. "Are you used to winning, huh? Or a bet you can't win?" Daniel raises an eyebrow, curious. "Tell me." "I bet you wouldn't last 6 months married to a woman who weighs 3 times as much as you," Ryan teases. "6 months, Daniel, there are no shortcuts. Prove me wrong and I'll give you $500,000. The room fell silent, eyes on the two men. Daniel, his pride at stake, chuckled with a hint of arrogance. 6 months? That's it? I'll bet." Ryan. Little did he know the bet would become more than a game. It would change his life forever. A few days after the bet was sealed, Daniel Carter received a name: Grace Thompson. She wasn't a glamorous socialite or a polished businesswoman. Far from it. Grace was a high school art teacher, someone who thrived in simplicity and creativity. Daniel smirked at the description, convinced that this would be nothing more than a minor detour in his life. Their first meeting took place at a cozy rustic cafe nestled in the corner of the city, a place Daniel would never have set foot in on his own. The wooden tables, walls adorned with paintings, and the scent of fresh coffee felt far removed from his usual 5-star world. When Grace walked in, Daniel's confidence faltered, if only for a moment. She wasn't flashy, yet there was something commanding about her presence. With her simple dress, paint-splattered bag, and an air of quiet self-assurance, Grace approached his table and looked him straight in the eyes. "You must be Daniel Carter," she said, her tone calm but assertive. Daniel, masking his surprise, stood and extended his hand with a well-rehearsed smile. "And you must be Grace Thompson." Grace hesitated for just a second before shaking his hand, her grip firm, definitely not intimidated. She sat down across from him and got straight to the point. "Let's not waste time, Daniel. I know about the bet," Grace said bluntly, her gaze unwavering. "I know the terms and the conditions." Daniel blinked, caught off guard by her bluntness. He hadn't expected this. "And yet you agreed to meet me. Why?" Grace tilted her head slightly as if weighing her words carefully. "Let's just say I have my reasons." She paused before adding, "But let me make one thing clear. If you think you can manipulate me or control me, you're mistaken. I'm not like the women you're used to." Daniel leaned back in his chair, intrigued. Grace was proving to be more than he had anticipated. This wasn't going to be as simple as he had thought. But strangely, the challenge made it all the more interesting. As their first meeting ended, Daniel couldn't help but feel unsettled yet curious. Grace was different, unapologetically herself. She didn't flinch under his presence, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was sitting across from someone he couldn't predict. And that intrigued him more than he was willing to admit. The wedding took place just 2 weeks after their first meeting. Daniel Carter, a man who thrived on carefully planned strategies, treated it like a business deal, efficient, quick, and without unnecessary emotion. There were no lavish decorations, no heartfelt vows, just signatures on a marriage certificate and a quiet ceremony at the courthouse. To Daniel, it was a mere formality, another step toward winning the bet and proving Ryan wrong. When Daniel brought Grace to his penthouse, an expansive glass-walled masterpiece overlooking the heart of Los Angeles, he expected her to be overwhelmed. The grand space, the priceless art, the towering skyline, it was a physical representation of his success, and he assumed it would impress her. But as Grace stepped into the penthouse for the first time, her expression remained neutral. She walked over to one of the massive windows, gazing out at the city below. 6 months, Daniel. Not a day more, she said softly, her voice firm. Daniel smirked. "We'll see about that." The next few days were a clash of two worlds. Daniel showered Grace with expensive gifts, designer clothes, diamond jewelry, and plans for extravagant trips. But Grace rejected them all. "I don't need these things, Daniel," she said calmly, placing yet another unopened gift box back on the table. Daniel couldn't hide his irritation. "Why do you have to be so difficult? Most people would dream of a life like this." Grace looked at him, her gaze piercing. "I'm not most people. Your money doesn't impress me, Daniel. I know who I am, and I don't need anyone else to define me." Her words stung more than Daniel cared to admit. He was used to being in control, to having people bend to his will. But Grace was different, unshakable, unmoved by his wealth and charm. It frustrated him, yet deep down, it intrigued him. Daniel's frustration soon turned into attempts to assert control. He began interfering with Grace's routine, questioning her work schedule and offering reasons why she didn't need to teach anymore. When Grace refused to back down, he tried manipulating situations, delaying her plans, forcing her to reschedule meetings, all in an effort to remind her of the power he thought he held. But no matter what he did, Grace remained firm, refusing to let him dictate her life. Her resilience only intensified Daniel's obsession with winning, not just the bet, but also the silent battle between them. Unbeknownst to Daniel, Grace was not just enduring his behavior, she was observing him, learning his weaknesses, and preparing for something much larger. Their relationship had turned into a tense standoff, and Daniel, so sure of his victory, didn't realize that the woman he had underestimated was slowly turning the tables. Months into their marriage, Daniel Carter believes he still has the upper hand. Although Grace resists his control at every turn, he reassures himself that her defenses will eventually crumble. What he doesn't realize is that Grace Thompson is far more cautious and patient than he could ever imagine. From the start, Grace has had a plan. While Daniel tries to manipulate her with gifts and control, she quietly collects information, documents, records, and files, painstakingly uncovering the truth behind her family's destruction. Daniel's company played a key role in forcing her father's small construction company into bankruptcy years ago. Every night, when Daniel assumes Grace is busy with her art supplies or lost in a book, she pieces together the evidence. Financial records, emails, old contracts, all point to Daniel's ruthless business practices. One night, while Daniel was out at a networking event, Grace sat at his desk, sifting through the files he had carelessly left open on his computer. Her hands shook as she read the emails. Cold, calculated decisions that prioritized profit over people. At the bottom of one particular message was the name of her father's company, Thompson Developments, circled in red with the words "ripe fruit, easy to pick," scrawled in the margin. Memories of her father, his tired eyes, his defeated expression as he lost everything, flooded back to her. Grace clenched her jaw, but she tried to keep her composure. She wasn't ready to confront Daniel. Not yet. A few days later, the confrontation finally came. It was a rainy evening, the kind where the sound of rain filled every quiet corner of Daniel's glass-enclosed penthouse. Grace sat at the dining room table, a stack of documents neatly arranged in front of her. As Daniel walked in, shaking the water from his jacket and loosening his tie, he recognized her demeanor immediately, calm, but too cautious. "What's this?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with suspicion as he took in the papers spread across the table. Grace looked up, her expression impassive. "Sit down, Daniel," he sneered, trying to hide his nervousness. "What's this? Another lecture of yours?" "No," Grace replied coolly, pushing the stack of papers toward him. "It's true." Daniel hesitated but eventually sat down. As his eyes scanned the pages, emails, contracts, financial statements, his smile disappeared. His face paled, his fingers gripping the edges of the papers. "Do you remember Thompson Developments?" Grace's voice was even, but tinged with bitterness. "It was a small construction company, run by my father. Until your company came along and tore it apart." Daniel looked up, his expression unreadable. "Grace, I didn't." "Don't lie to me," Grace interrupted sharply. "I have proof. You labeled us low-hanging fruit. You manipulated the deals, increased the costs, and backed my father into a corner until he had no choice but to close everything." Daniel opened his mouth to reply, but the words failed him. He had always viewed business as a game he played ruthlessly to win. But for the first time, he saw the cost of his decisions clearly before his eyes. "You destroyed my family," Grace continued, her voice breaking slightly. "My father was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened to him. The stress, the shame. It took his life, and my mother died with him. It took me away from my family overnight." Daniel looked down, guilt rising like a tidal wave. "I don't know," he whispered. "You don't care," Grace replied. "You're too busy building your empire to care about the people you're trampling on." "Why?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel, the man who always had an answer for everything, found himself speechless for the first time. "I married you because I wanted you to know what it felt like to be manipulated and powerless," Grace said, standing up. "But unlike you, I'm not doing this to destroy you. I'm doing this so you can finally see the consequences of your actions." She turned to leave, but before she stepped away, she glanced back one last time. 6 months, Daniel. That was our deal. But don't think of me as the one in control anymore." As the door slammed behind her, Daniel slumped back in his chair, the weight of her words crushing him. For the first time in his life, he saw himself not as a victor, but as a villain. And for the first time, he questioned everything he thought he knew about success, power, and himself. The confrontation with Grace left Daniel Carter shaken to his core. For days, her words replayed endlessly in his mind. You didn't care. The truth was undeniable, and for the first time in his life, Daniel was forced to confront the kind of man he had become. A man who saw people as pawns and success as his only prize. Grace had every right to hate him. Her father's downfall, her family's suffering, it all traced back to the decisions he'd made without a second thought. The guilt was relentless, gnawing at him like a shadow he couldn't escape. But amidst the weight of shame, a single thought grew stronger. He needed to change. Not for the sake of the bet, not to win Grace back as some kind of victory, but because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't. Daniel began to reflect on everything he'd done, every ruthless decision, every person he'd hurt. It wasn't enough to say he was sorry. Words meant nothing without action. Over the following days, Daniel took his first steps toward redemption. He began to show Grace that he was no longer the same man who had arrogantly walked into their marriage months earlier. It started small. The flowers. Grace loved wildflowers. Simple, vibrant, and unpretentious. One morning, Daniel left a modest bouquet of wildflowers on the kitchen table with no note. Grace noticed them but said nothing. However, Daniel saw the slight pause in her step, the way her fingers brushed the petals before she moved on. It was progress, however small. From that day forward, Daniel focused on the details. He noticed the little things about Grace, the way she took her coffee, strong with no sugar, the peaceful way she lost herself in her painting, the books she loved reading in the evening light. He didn't force conversations. He didn't try to explain himself. Instead, he was simply present. When she sat on the balcony at night, gazing out at the city, Daniel would quietly place a cup of tea beside her, the way she liked it, and walk away. At first, Grace remained distant, keeping her walls firmly in place. She didn't trust Daniel, and she wasn't going to let his small gestures sway her easily. But as time passed, she began to notice something different. Daniel wasn't playing games anymore. He wasn't trying to buy her forgiveness with grand gestures or hollow promises. His actions were small, thoughtful, and consistent. Slowly, Grace saw glimpses of a man who was genuinely trying, not because he wanted to win, but because he wanted to be better. One evening, Grace found Daniel sitting in the living room lost in thought. It wasn't the Daniel she had first met, the confident, untouchable tycoon. This Daniel looked tired, humbled, and, most surprisingly, vulnerable. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, breaking the silence. Daniel looked up, surprised. He set the book he had been holding aside and answered honestly. "Because I need to." He paused, searching for the right words. "For the longest time, I thought winning was all that mattered. I didn't care about the people I hurt along the way. But now, I can't stop thinking about the lives I destroyed. About your father." Grace watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. Daniel continued, his voice low but steady. "I know I can't fix the past, Grace. I can't bring back what I took from you. But I want to try to be someone better. Not just for you, but for myself. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to prove to you that I can change." For the first time, Grace felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Hope. The weeks that followed were a quiet transformation. Daniel spent more time helping others, something Grace began to hear about through whispers at her school and in the community. He reached out to small businesses he had once overlooked, offering support to rebuild what they had lost. More importantly, Daniel no longer approached Grace as if she were part of a game he had to win. He gave her space, respect, and sincerity, something that spoke louder than any grand gesture ever could. Grace, despite her lingering doubts, couldn't ignore the change she saw. She noticed the way Daniel listened when she spoke, the way he acknowledged his mistakes without excuses. It was as if he had torn down the walls of his own ego and was rebuilding himself from the ground up. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Grace finally broke the silence. "You've changed, Daniel." Daniel turned to her, his expression earnest. "I'm trying. Every day." Grace held his gaze, the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. "I see that." For Daniel, those 3 words meant everything. He knew it wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that there might still be hope for them both. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind where the world outside seemed to slow down. Daniel Carter stood on the balcony of his penthouse, a glass of wine in his hand, staring at the sprawling Los Angeles skyline. It had been weeks since his life began to change. Weeks of slow progress, careful conversations, and slowly chipped away at the walls between him and Grace Thompson. That night, Grace joined him on the balcony. She held her own glass of wine, her expression calmer than it had been in months. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air between them, once thick with tension, now carried a sense of quiet understanding. "I don't know if I ever said it before," Daniel started, his voice low and steady. "But I'm sorry, Grace. For everything. For your father. For the hurt I caused. I know I can't erase it." Grace looked at him, her gaze softer but still guarded. "Do you think a simple sorry can fix everything, Daniel?" Her voice wavered slightly, a crack in her usual calm demeanor. She turned to look out at the city, the lights reflecting the storm inside her. "I spent years holding on to anger, believing you were nothing but a monster. But now?" She paused, finally meeting his eyes. "You've changed. You're not the same man I met months ago, and maybe I don't want to hold on to that anger anymore." They stood there for a while, the silence speaking volumes. Daniel turned to look at her, the faint glow of city lights reflecting in her eyes. "I don't want to lose you, Grace," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Not after everything." Grace met his gaze, and for the first time, she smiled. A real, unguarded smile. "Maybe you won't." Inside the penthouse, the evening stretched on. They sat across from each other on the couch, wine glasses in hand, sharing stories and quiet laughter. Daniel listened more than he spoke, letting Grace's voice fill the room as she told him about her students, her art, and her dreams. pieces of herself she had once kept hidden from him. The evening stretched on, their laughter softening into quiet conversations that seemed to carry more weight than words ever could. For the first time, they weren't two adversaries locked in a silent war. They were just Daniel and Grace, stripped of all pretense. When Daniel leaned in, there was a hesitation, a question in his eyes. Grace's breath caught, her heart pounding, but she didn't pull away. Their lips met, and the kiss was soft, tentative, as if testing the waters of a fragile connection. But then, all the walls came down. The kiss deepened, filled with the emotions they had buried for so long. Regret, hope, longing. That night, for the first time, they let go of the past. In each other's arms, they found a moment of peace, of love that neither of them had dared to believe in before. That night, for the first time, they came together not as adversaries, but as two people finally allowing themselves to feel, to let down their walls and embrace the possibility of love. 3 months later, Grace found herself standing nervously in the kitchen. Daniel, unaware of what was coming, looked up from his coffee as she walked in. "Daniel," Grace began, her voice trembling slightly as she entered the room. He looked up from his coffee, immediately sensing something different. "What's wrong?" Grace hesitated, her hands fidgeting as she searched for the right words. Finally, she took a deep breath and smiled faintly. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, Daniel froze, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes widened and a slow, disbelieving smile spread across his face. "You're pregnant?" he repeated softly, as if to confirm he wasn't dreaming. When Grace nodded, tears brimming in her eyes, Daniel let out a shaky laugh, crossing the room in 2 strides and pulling her into his arms. "You've just given me the greatest gift I could ever ask for," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I promise I'll get it right this time, Grace. I swear." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Daniel stared at her, processing the words, before his face broke into a mix of joy and disbelief. "Are you serious?" Grace nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Yes." Without a word, Daniel crossed the room and wrapped her in his arms, holding her tightly. "You've just given me the greatest gift I could ever ask for," he whispered. "This time I'm going to get it right. I promise." Months later, Daniel and Grace stood hand in hand in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by close friends and family. The vows they exchanged were simple but heartfelt, words that carried the weight of everything they had been through. As they danced slowly at the end of the evening, Grace rested her head on Daniel's shoulder and whispered with a smile, "Who would have thought all of this started with a bet?" Daniel chuckled softly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "The best mistake I ever made," he replied. And as the music played and laughter filled the air, they embraced the next chapter of their lives together. A story of forgiveness, love, and a future they had fought so hard to build.